Good evening. I'm Maryam Alavi, Dean of the Georgia Tech Scheller College of Business. Thank you for joining us for the second presentation in our Dean's DE&I speaker series for this academic year. For tonight's event, we are excited to welcome Beyah, Global Chief Talent Officer at Huge, one of the world's foremost brand development and design firms based in Brooklyn, New York. In fact, Fast Company named Huge one of the best places to work for innovators earlier this year. The mission of Huge is to be a catalyst for change and create a world where their people, clients, and users have equal opportunities to create, build, and grow, strengthened by diversity of thought, backgrounds, and perspectives. Callie brings over 20 years of experience as a talent strategist, trusted business partner, people leader, and problem solver. At Huge, she is responsible for the HR talent function across the global organization, including culture, recruiting, organizational development, DE&I, and HR operations. Before Huge, she served as head of talent for Delta Airlines, leading end-to-end talent strategy and implementation for Delta's global workforce of 90,000 employees. Callie has been recognized as a super lawyer, outstanding Atlantan, and as one of the Atlanta Business Chronicle's 40 under 40. She holds a Bachelor of Arts from Florida A&M University and a JD from the Vanderbilt University School of Law. Callie, thank you for your time today. I can only imagine the demands on your schedule and the amount of work that goes into driving the success of an organization as big as Huge.
Thank you, Dean Alavi. It's a pleasure to be here. And you're right, it's quite the time to be in the business of looking after people and culture. It couldn't matter more. So thanks for having me to have this conversation, and diversity, equity, inclusion at the center of it. I love that you're having this series.
Thank you. After we hear from you, we will open the floor to the audience for their questions. To those in the audience, please submit your questions through the Q&A function, and Callie will address as many as possible. Again, Callie, welcome, and it is all yours now.
All right, perfect. Thank you, and thanks again for having me. And thank you to all who've joined us this evening. I know a number of friends in the audience, and great to be here with the Georgia Tech Scheller College of Business community. As Dean Alavi mentioned, I'm Kali Beyah. My pronouns are she, her, and I have the pleasure of leading people and culture at Huge. I want to talk a little bit tonight as part of the Dean's Diversity Series around diversity, equity, inclusion, and particularly thinking of it through the lens of leadership, because the truth is it is all part and parcel, inextricably linked, that there cannot be great leadership in our organizations and among our people without thinking through and doing the work of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So on that note, I'll get started. I've got some slides, and I'm thinking they're coming up here any minute. Perfect. Hello, and let's jump in to talk about this really timely topic on the heels of 2020 and as we continue in 2021, and a long history of opportunity for our nation, for our world, to get diversity, equity, and inclusion right, and to reckon with what it means in our day-to-day and the threads and systems that are part of our organizations. And then what is our part in humanizing the work here in the first place? I recently was listening to one of my favorite thought leaders on the topic, Ika Bethea, and she was saying something I think is so important to recognize, that more than asking for the business case, there needn't be one, although there is quite the strong one for diversity, equity, inclusion in that work, because it's a case of humanity, that there ought not need to be a ton of business case to understand why people ought to be treated as people and with the same opportunities and benefit of the doubt, if you will, that we allot others. So with that in mind, but also recognizing that the business case couldn't be stronger as our nation continues and our world continue to evolve, let's dive right in. Next slide. It's 1969, and there's a story in the New York Times. The story reports that on September 27th, 1969, Yale broke tradition and went co-ed. I love this story and this picture for a couple of reasons, and I want to use them to anchor our conversation this evening. First, the story just gets it right in saying that Yale broke tradition. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that means, how that translates for doing the work of diversity, equity, and inclusion. But I also love this photo for the story it doesn't tell, for what is not captioned here. It doesn't tell you that these young women on the far end of the photo are just 8 weeks into their experience at a college that wasn't built to have them. That the two Black men next to those women are just a few years into a college that wasn't meant to have them either. And that in the midst of all that, what you see is a level of connection and consistency here. It doesn't tell you the story of the Black woman on the far end who, as one of just a few Black women in that first class of women at Yale College, had trouble finding a roommate who was up for living with her as a Black woman on campus. That was her entry into the college experience. So this picture and how we'll talk about it, I want to just anchor in that it tells a story, and then there's a story that's captioned. And very much that reflects what this work of diversity, equity, inclusion is. That it is seeing the story that's told, reading the caption or reading the moment, but then also being curious behind it. What's that story? What's that human story? What are the factors that brought us to this moment? And then what do we do about it? So with that in mind, and thinking about the line that the New York Times captured so well about breaking tradition, let's get started in talking about 3 key factors in doing the work of diversity, equity, and inclusion today. The first is breaking tradition. That in truth, that's what happened when a college went co-ed. When women got to vote, these are the things that break tradition, which is all we need to know about the fact that traditions are worth interrogating. So what does it mean to break tradition? What does it take for our companies, for our organizations, and for people, right? Because an organization, our companies, they only reflect the people that make them up, right? The shadow that the leaders cast, or that the culture that we all reflect. So I want to talk about what does it take to break tradition and what does it look like? How do we know that we're doing it? What are the things we do to do that in furtherance of a more diverse, equitable, and inclusive workplace? First, breaking tradition takes a level of confidence and a level of leadership and awareness, right? So just being able to step out and say, hey, we feel strong enough, we know who we are, we have that confidence as an organization, as an individual. We are aware of privilege, of imposter syndrome, of internalized oppression, all of the things that make for the ecosystem that we're in. And in that awareness, in that strength of character, right? Because I think even organizations can have a strength of character. We are then going to do the thing that is breaking a tradition. Maybe it's becoming co-ed, maybe it's being one of the 41 companies that have a woman CEO in the Fortune 500, or the 2 that have a Black woman CEO. But let's talk about what that looks like in the day to day. The first is interrogating the norm. And that can be big and small. So it's interrogating the norms in your job descriptions, right, for your company. What's that language? What are the requirements? Are they real? How many times have you said, we're going to open up a role, our company opened up a role, and really the job description got pulled out of a bank of job descriptions, and no one ever looked at it to say, what does this do to create, further perpetuate norms? How do we unlock that? Perhaps it's even in dialogue around what rotation opportunities am I after, or are people getting in the organization, and what are we requiring, and are we consistent? So for example, how often is it that someone says, in our company, we talk about, oh, we want to round this leader out. they need to do this rotation in addition to the other 2 rotations. And I think it's worth interrogating. And the work of breaking tradition is interrogating to say, is it necessary to do that 3rd rotation? And that's fine if it is, right? To what end? But let's be sure that then when the next person comes along or someone who looks different, do they have to do that 3rd rotation? Is it custom to that person? Is it equitably administered? Those are the kinds of things that breaking tradition, breaking these norms require. It's succession planning. When in companies, one of my favorite things that we get to do is succession plan. But I think it's really pretty common for organizations to look at succession plans, and the norms, the traditions are to look in the same 3 practice areas, the same pockets of the business. This P&L is usually the creator of the C-suite, or this is where we usually find our potential next CFO, and interrogating that, right? And also saying, hey, we've got 5 people, the same 5 players mapped to 20 jobs in the future. That's not even real. Breaking those traditions, those habits, that's the work of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Another tradition that I would say, when you say we're breaking tradition, even in these little ways that then all get at unlocking systems, is managing the role of relationship capital in the future of our organizations, of our companies, of our opportunities. That often, how an opportunity comes along has to do with the opening of the opportunity, the capability of the people involved, but then also often the relationship. And how do we manage that so that it does not have an outsized impact on opportunity? Really looking at those traditions, those habits, right? Habits are what make up our days, our organizations, our companies, and interrogating those. And a couple of the levers to do that are transparency, right? So that it's not all inside baseball. So that the person in that photo who is a first-time college entrant doesn't have to know the inside baseball, the unwritten rules. Transparency of that, the access and exposure. If access and exposure are the capital that speak the most in your organization, and it's very common that they are, how are we then enabling, setting up processes, systems, experiences that make access and capital not dependent on similarities? So this first layer is breaking tradition. It's doing exactly what Yale did when it went co-ed in 1969 and breaking tradition. It's also doing what we talked about that photo, which is looking behind what we're used to, looking behind the caption to understand where's that opportunity. Let's talk about the second element. Next slide. Don't stay on the sidelines. So this, in the photo that we use as our anchor here, they're on the sidelines, but it reminded me, my daughter is now 14, but when she was about 4 years old, she was invited by her gymnastics location to join the cheer team. And that just wasn't a match for her. She said, why would I want to stay on the sidelines while everyone gets to have fun on the field, right? And there's work to be done on the sidelines, but the point here, when it comes to doing the work of diversity, equity, and inclusion, we cannot stay on the sidelines. And that's, we've often heard people talk about silence as being complicit. That's staying on the sidelines, but there's also less obvious staying on the sidelines when we're doing this work of leading with DE&I at our center. And I'd say there are 2 prongs to think about here. It's staying on the sidelines in the social action realm, right, where we saw posts last year and folks coming off the sidelines. But then there's also staying on the sidelines in the everyday. What you see in your workplace, what you see in your grocery store, how we create opportunity in our organizations. Where are we not staying on the sidelines? I'll talk again about what's it take and what's it look like. So what's it take? It takes courage, right? Discomfort, listening, but most of all, it takes consistency. Practice and building the muscles of speaking out when it's uncomfortable. And the examples are, let's take when we had the recent voter restriction laws, right? Standing up about that. Certainly last year, I don't even know if you'd say it takes a ton of courage to cross the street in a crowd by the end of last year where people had posts, but I think there's a recognition that there were organizations and people who did that well before and who have their actions afterward have reflected that courage. But consistency is also so key, because at the end of the day, we build our sort of credibility in our DE&I work by what we do every day. So there's certain companies that if they come out and they say they, are against a certain law in the social action realm, there might be a little side eye. That doesn't sound consistent with what I've known of their brand. So doing that work in the everyday and practicing the muscle of not being on the sidelines is a key. And respecting the work of diversity, equity, inclusion as really a discipline that helps you be informed and capable when you come off the sidelines, so that we come off the sidelines and we act responsibly. What does that really look like, right? What's it look like in the day-to-day to not stay on the sidelines? Not just in the posting and now hopefully staying accountable way, but also in the everyday. It looks like micro affirmations, right? We often talk about microaggressions, but what are the micro affirmations? It's the moment in the meeting where you recognize that someone's said something even though they got talked over. So you might say, can you finish what you were saying? I didn't get to hear your complete thought. It's offering up your pronouns first off so that you make space for others to do the same. It's calling out unsupported extrapolation. How often in a workplace do you hear, and I've heard it from time to time over my career, where someone will say, oh, the last woman who went on maternity leave in that group didn't come back. That's unsupported extrapolation, sort of applying that to the next person who's going to go on maternity leave and assuming they'll make that. That's the stuff to call out. That's what not standing on the sidelines looks like. It's following through and the accountability. So it's all the promises and commitments we made as anti-racist organizations last year. Those were not standing on the sidelines, sure, but the key now is what's the accountability? What's that work look like? And how are we embedding that in our work, our conversations and organizations? It's also calibrating, right? That not one voice owns the conversation, but it's when we're talking about possibilities about what strategy we're going to pursue in our business, or we're talking about what path someone might have in their career, that there are many voices in the room and every voice has a chance to come off the sidelines and be in the conversation, that we make space for that and we honor the voices. And then the other thing I'd say on not staying on the sidelines is recognizing that there's an art to coming and a science to coming off the sidelines. More than ever today, there's an appreciation, I think, for the work of diversity, equity, inclusion, and increasingly an understanding that there's a real discipline to having a strategy for what you're going to do on the field, a strategy that honors the dimensions of diversity, a strategy that informs and recognizes that there are things that no matter what dimension I might identify with, there are things I won't know. And if I want a truly inclusive workplace and company, how do we honor that? So it's having the expertise at the table so that when we come off the sidelines, we've got that to deploy and we're measuring against that. And the other element I'd say, when you see it, not staying on the sidelines, what's that look like? It's valuing impact over activity. It can be really easy to be, there's like action bias is a real danger even actually in the diversity, equity, inclusion space, because action bias is often about what do I, the person who's hearing something that happened, what do I feel and need to do to make me feel like I've done something, as opposed to honoring the fact that, hey, look, following the death of George Floyd, the murder of George Floyd last year, the pain of that and the underlying messages it said about our country, those were not new. And so the rush to action and the bias for action in that moment, we ought to also honor that that was not new for the most impacted, the most traumatized by those events. So balancing that and then being sure that what we do and our actions are about impact and not just activity, and also coming to them with the right spirit. When we come off the sidelines, we come at it not from a charitable or savior spirit, but from a spirit of understanding, curiosity, and really appreciating the full picture and listening and making space for the pieces we don't know. So not staying on the sidelines is a second really key part of doing the work of diversity, equity, inclusion in our workplaces. And the next step, the third, next slide, thank you, is have a squad and be the squad. And what that means is no one goes it alone. So in that photo, you see the squad, and there is, one of the untold stories is that even in the midst of those women being new on campus, even in the midst of the Black woman on the end who happens to be my mother, being new and having trouble finding someone who wanted to be her roommate in college. That squad, that football team in the office, they became her community. They came to her wedding. That's the other piece. And so she had to have a squad for that journey in carving that path. What else does that look like, having a squad? I think many of us have experienced that, the gift of having a squad, and very specifically. So, and I want to be clear about what it means in terms of doing this work and having a squad and being the squad. It's twofold, right? Because it's not just friendship, and sponsorship is an important part of what it really is. But the other thing to know is, it's sponsorship with great intentionality and planning. It's recognizing that, career highs don't happen on accident. They just don't. When people make it to their steps, somebody, them plus opportunity plus relationship, those things coalesce to make that happen. So in being a squad, it's that intentionality. I had the good fortune a couple times in my career to have a great squad. And those folks often were people who I would say were currency rich, right? So, and when I say currency rich, it's, what's the currency of your workplace? And most workplaces have relationship currency, for example. There's also performance currency. That's the currency that I create in the work I do. But there's also the currency of just whose voice gets listened to, right? That relationship currency plus just the sort of weighting that comes from the voice. And so I've had the good fortune of having people in the squad who had that currency, but also then had the generosity. And maybe generosity is not the word, right? Because it's not charitable, but they had what I'd say is the security to say, I can share the currency I have. I want to use this currency for others and in the direction of supporting someone I know who is capable, but also very underrepresented in an organization. So help me, I can show you how to carve this path. And it can be that specific in terms of having a squad and being in the squad. So for example, when I was a lawyer, when I was a lawyer looking to make partner, there were real specific factors that go into making partner. Or when I was at Delta looking to be at the next level of director, or when I was at my next step trying to move from being a lawyer into HR, there were sponsors and folks who had the key currency who were my squad. And they were the squad with intentionality. They shared the factors, right? Teach to the test. If you know the test, that's what it is to be the squad, right? Is to be that generous person, to share that currency, to tell sort of these are the things we're going to be looking at, this part of the revenue, we're going to be looking at these receivables, we're going to look at this utilization rate, these factors, so that the transparency is there and the inside baseball becomes not the same thing. And that's a big piece of being a squad and creating more equitable opportunity in organizations. Owning the voice, right? So owning your voice, and now I get to be the squad for people and own my voice, build my voice, and use it in the direction of other people's success. Companies get to do that for folks, right? And supporting them in their development. The other thing I'd say in diversity, equity, and inclusion work around having a squad and being the squad is really a key leadership principle that I've seen at work, and also have gotten to see when it doesn't come together. And it is recognizing that no one person is, that we all have blind spots, and that if we can aim for a bit of a composite leadership, right, that says together there's a rich whole that makes better decisions, that drives better business. And that's so well documented by the McKinsey studies on women in the workplace, on diversity in the workplace, that having these teams gets you to better outcomes. It makes that business case, of course, but it also is important as thought leaders and thought partners when we do the work of diversity, equity, and inclusion to make sure that we're getting a full story. What is my blind spot? I don't speak for a monolith of of a group or an identity. And so having that squad, and today that means having your chief diversity officer be at the table in a meaningful way. Our chief diversity officer at Huge is on our executive leadership team, and she really enriches our work and our thinking around both diversity, equity, inclusion, but also around the work we do as a business and what we decide is really important for spending our time to get to impact, not just activity. Your chief talent officer, I mean, the role of a chief talent officer in CHRO these days is so key when people are reassessing what is work supposed to be. Does my workplace reflect purpose? Does it take the actions I think that are aligned with my beliefs, or at least ones that I really can appreciate and respect that feel right? Since I spend much of my days there, those are the kinds of things people are grappling with. And so the work and the partnership of being a squad at the corporate level in terms of a leadership team, a proper, rich, everyone's got a voice that gets heard leadership team matters now, I would argue, more than ever. And the other things that are factors in what it looks like to have a squad and be a squad: transparency, as I mentioned, sort of teaching to the test. If you know the insights of what it takes, then let's provide them. Competency models often do that, recognizing there's subjective and application often, but at least having the objective measures and sharing those things are key, clear expectations. Those are sort of diversity hygiene, I would say, that we should be looking at our organizations to have. And to be building, right? Because they can be very fluid given the skilling and upskilling that happens in our workforce. The other thing is measuring it, holding people accountable. At the end of the day, we get to create an ecosystem that reinforces what we say matters. So having a squad, being the squad, how would we reinforce that? That would be looking at leader effectiveness and measures of that, whether coming from surveys that talk about whether people get the feedback and hear what they need, or whether it's looking at teams and saying, we will have no homogenous teams in our organization. Every leader is accountable to not have homogenous teams. We are going to assess and review our survey feedback across demographics, because employee experience is where the real richness happens, right? We don't want to just be collecting people and growing our numbers without ensuring our experiences reflect equitably across demographics. So those are the kinds of things that reflect we value being the squad, and reinforce that in our ecosystem. In addition to leader effectiveness, looking at what talent has been exported or imported across an organization, and not just by, did you as a leader, are you accountable to have done that, right? To have said, hey, I grew people, I invested, I nurtured careers. And then we look across and see what the trends are, right? Do all those people look like me? Who's in a seat because I helped to nurture their career? And what are the demographics? So is there some similarity? Am I only touching this piece? Those are the kinds of things, even as individuals, we can hold ourselves accountable to do as we write our stories and really help make diversity, equity, inclusion part of the DNA of our organizations, of ourselves, and for our world as well. And then, so let me just take us back to this next step, or take us back to where we started. Next slide. So we talked about three things here that are the keys, right, to diversity, equity, inclusion, leadership in our organization and in our communities. The first was breaking tradition, right? Just saying we interrogate the norms, and we turn them on their heads and recognize there is systemic systems, systemic processes, systemic bias to really unlock and dismantle. And we break those traditions. The second is we don't stay on the sidelines. There is work to do out in the game, and it's serious work. We trust the discipline of that work, and we get prepared to honor the seriousness and weight of that work before we go out with listening and with practice and getting okay with being uncomfortable. And then third, we have a squad and we get to be the squad, right? So that's sponsorship, that's a coalition in your workplace of folks that help make the best and richer decisions together. And it's also making sure that there's somebody at this table that wouldn't be here if I hadn't helped invest in them, or at least I made it faster. I accelerated their progress. I got to do a panel a couple of weeks ago, maybe a couple months ago, with about 4 or 5 women who we had worked together 15 years ago in law firms. And several of them are partners now. They lead aspects of companies at major companies, general counsels. And we got to talk about being a tribe and how together there was that investment in being the squad, and how we could look around and go, we helped make this happen for one another. So I think that's the question we get to ask ourselves in really saying, is diversity, equity, inclusion something we are living out as companies and as individuals and as leaders? If we don't have somebody we can look around and say, That's what we helped make happen. And those are people who helped make it happen for me. There's work to do. So when we started out on this conversation talking about the story, right? The story that the New York Times had written, the story that was untold, and being curious about that. And I think the diversity, equity, work of diversity, equity, inclusion is just like that. That there's a story, and there's a story that's written, there's a story that's captioned, and our question and our task is to decide what role we're going to play in the stories of the future, the stories of today, and the stories of the underrepresented identities that are around. And do we want to play the role of author, right? Writing my own great story, the legacy, writing my legacy in reverse, right? I want to be able to say there are folks who are here. The workforce is richer, more diverse, more inclusive, and more equitable because of the work we did. I want to author that story. Do you want to co-author the story of someone who's coming along beside or behind you, right? To be writing on that page and making the story something different than just a caption, but a richer story that we understood and helped to write. Or you can just decide to be a character, right? Just, I'm a character in the story. And that, I think, is the path that we can avoid. Of being just a character. We have a chance to write the story, we have the tools, and I hope you've heard from me today a few of the strategies that you can look for that say, I'm writing the story as intended. I'm making this page better, and this is a chapter we can all be proud of. Next slide. I'll take any questions.
Our first question is from Sherry. She says, thank you so much for your presentation. How can the DEI role address algorithmic oppression and promote ethical data?
So, I love this question because there is so much an appreciation for the science of it, right? That there is actual work in math that is often being shown, whether it's in AI or algorithmic data. And your question about how does the CDO role do this, I'd say there are probably two key pieces. One is having the data inside out, right? Because one of the things that always happens is everybody wants to know, well, what about this data, and unpack the data, and there will always be questions about the data. So the key first is the data being really conversant in what the data is as a CDO. And then the second, I'd say, is partnership. And having what I'd say is the influence capital to have conversation and to say, hey, here's a person who's going to help me spread this information, educate folks on it. And then the third factor, I said two, but I'd say the third is then having a plan of action. Because as we surface bias, surface the work to be done, there's also surfacing what are we going to do? And the other key for the CDO in that action plan is to say, we own this story together. Right? We are co-authors as a leadership team and as an organization. We own that story at every step, right, of what we're going to do, whether it's in our hiring, our experience, or other elements of our workplace. So those three factors of really the data being rich and well understood and communicated clearly in an actionable way, having the right partners. There's a bit of diplomacy. I spent a little window of my career as a lobbyist, and there is no better example of how alliances in communication and getting things, strategies over the line, how critical it is. And then that last factor of what do we do with it?
Do you recommend unconscious bias training? If so, how do we ensure its efficacy?
Ooh, that yes, and yes, and. So yes, at the end of it, there is certainly need for fluency at all levels in diversity, equity, inclusion. And so what that looks like, whether it's bystander training, unconscious bias training, but an acknowledgement of it and awareness building is important. But I say the yes and because what has got to happen is that it cannot be check the box standalone. And it's got to be rich enough. At the end of the day, I find myself quite annoyed if I go to a training and it sort of says, you like wine, I like wine. We have something in common. It cannot be overly simplistic It's got to be rich and willing to touch what is challenging and difficult and make people a little uncomfortable. And then it's got to be part of a holistic strategy. To what end? Where will we now mitigate these biases? Now we're conscious of the biases. How do we have clarity, transparency, robust discussions, sort of key levers that then map into mitigating the biases we're now aware of? Be aware of them by themselves is sort of like, oh, great, but there's so much more to do. So the answer is yes, as part of a holistic strategy.
The next question is from Drew. The example you shared about hiring managers using old job descriptions with exclusive language spoke to me. Do you have suggestions of other exclusive traditions that companies should change that they may not realize they are perpetuating?
Well, the key levers, hiring and promotion are they're just the key access creating levers. So those are the places I would start. And for example, with job descriptions and being more thoughtful about those, there are tools out, Textio and other tools that help you get at that. And really ensure the language is not coded or biased in any way. But then at the other steps, there are other key things I'd say. One is assessments, and what kinds of assessments are being done in terms of how people interview and select talent, and having more structure around that. Having, I've had an experience where we did assessments that really helped us both spot where the bias was and then adjust our systems and processes to combat and mitigate the bias. Promotion is a big spot for it. So understanding here are the elements that lead to promotion, sort of a causal chain. So if promotion happens at this stage and it happens with this group of stakeholders, one, making sure the group of stakeholders is rich, has real meaningful conversation, not just one person controlling a person's career, having structure and a little bit of and a framework around how those promotions happen, including a transparent framework. And those are hard things to do, right? I mean, or not hard, but they're things that can be inconvenient. And that is often what gets in the way. People will say, we don't want bureaucracy. We don't want it to take so long. But the truth is there's nothing we do that's more important to be unbiased in than creating economic mobility and opportunity for people's growth. And so taking a beat to be aware is important. The other thing I'd say is having bias checkers or mitigating at the beginning of conversation processes, whether we're talking together about hiring, talking together about promotion, talking together about an assignment people might go on, having literally a checklist. There's data that shows having a checklist of these are the kinds of biases and actually giving that out at the conversation, right? So it's a little harder to do if you're virtual, but giving that out is actually even more effective. That list of sort of bias checkers, similarity bias, halo effect, those things, is more effective to give it out and sort of have the pause, the physical mindfulness moment of looking at that, than even if I send it out to you in advance and say, please be mindful of that. So those are some key factors around opportunity, or key levers and key moments that we can really mitigate and be more thoughtful about where there's bias in our processes and systems.
Okay, thank you. The next question is from Trina. Please talk about the challenges that come with breaking traditions. For the great majority, DEI is seen as a binary game with winners and losers, making it hard to have real impact, not just window dressing.
So there's a couple elements in here that I just have to love. One is the binary question, right? I mean, one of the things that is important about breaking tradition and interrogating is rejecting false dichotomies, right? That, if we, the phrase of, well, they have to be qualified. Well, that implies there's some binary choice about having an underrepresented identity and a qualified identity, right? So love sort of the premise in your question of rejecting false dichotomies in the first place. And then, your question about, how does it work? It's hard, breaking tradition. There's a couple things about breaking tradition, and these are things I look for in companies that I've worked for, or in leaders that I've worked with or beside. And one of them is, I called it organizational competence, but there is a level of if the organization and the people are confident, they are willing to take more, to do things that they think are right. And I'll take an example would be religious freedom, right? The religious freedom laws that were proposed a couple years ago and have resurfaced over time, at least here in Georgia. The company, when I was at Delta, there was no hesitation about taking a stand on it. But I would say it was definitely, we had leadership and a brand that we knew what our compass was, and we knew who our employees were and the right stance on it. So that made it less hard, right? And so a level of conviction is a piece that I think is worth looking for when you're looking for places and people with whom to work, knowing that versus, oh, I only cross the street in a crowd, right? That's, I think, something to be aware of. I often have observed, insecurity is the root of a lot of bad behavior in organizations, just insecurity. So looking for that security, those are the things that make it less hard. And look, at the end of the day, you're right. There are there risks? Were there repercussions? Sure, all day. And a big piece of it is just understanding the larger calculus of what helps your organization sleep at night. And what do you want that legacy to be? What's that story we're looking to write? And then being able to settle that down. And then that's when having a squad is also not bad. People who at least we can affirm, or organizations that can align together to affirm taking those right steps to break tradition.
Thank you. What industries do you think are furthest ahead on this that can serve as models for those other industries with aspirations to make real contributions in moving the needle?
Industries. I don't know that I could paint a really broad industry brush on what industries are farther ahead, because I think there are a couple of ways that being farther ahead shows up. So, for example, the industry I'm in with Huge, marketing and design is, I would say, very much progressive minded, forward thinking, and it's had the organizational confidence for us to do things that I feel really proud about. So there's that in terms of mindset. So I do think you're looking at mindset, but then I think you're also looking at who's farther ahead or a model in actions and what they've done. And I'd say, for it's whatever flaws it has, Google for many years ago has had a lot of these good practices in place as well. So there are tech companies who have the right practices and have a lot of really good expertise. Although the third prong is, but who's bringing it to life? And I think that's the tricky part. I often, if I was looking at companies that are probably doing especially well, and I call out, it'd be Merck. Under Melody Hobson's leadership of their board, really was one of the first places to have accountability around progress and diversity, equity, inclusion, and being really clear and unapologetic about that. So if I was going to call it a company, it'd be Merck when she was at the leadership role as the chair of their board.
Any tips for forming a strong squad?
So I'd say probably 2 or 3 things. There's a great, we used to do a great workshop on forming your personal board of directors. So I'll probably steal a few things from there for forming your great squad. Let me just first say, when I'm saying squad here in this context, it is primarily your work squad. Your work squad and your personal squad can often be overlapping. Mine certainly have been very much so, thankfully, in my career. But the key elements of forming a great squad are, one, having it be a mix of people. Folks who are not just like you at different levels, who do different roles, who are inside your organization and outside your organization. That balance is important because it gives you more perspective. It gives you reference points, right? To say, oh, I thought this was so crazy, but actually it's crazier over here. Or, oh, that's really interesting. I can look more laterally. I can break the mold and look at opportunities I might not have thought about. So being informed by different folks in different sectors, different divisions in an organization and different levels is important. When I say having it be a diverse group, the truth is, in the companies I've been in, white men held the most capital, if you will, in the organization. And when I say capital, I mean they were in the leadership positions. They were often the folks who helped influence what the future was. And so I wanted to be part of that future. Those relationships proved to be remarkably valuable in that. There were also times when I needed folks who looked just like me for things that I needed to navigate and talk about in a really safe space. So having people who reflected my identity as a mom, as a Black woman, those were factors as well. So I would say those are key factors of sector, identity, diversity, and level. And then the last would be just knowing where you want to go is another factor in having the right squad, is having, or at least having some sense of it to say, okay, I think I'd like to be in this direction. Let me have folks in my mix that are in that direction. The last piece I'd share is it doesn't have to be way up here, the person or the people in your squad. They don't have to be, they can be one step ahead. They can be lateral. I've definitely seen people who, basically got hired at their next company by somebody who used to work for them on their team. So be good to everyone. And then the other thing is they don't have to be like coffee dinner buds. My best sponsors in my career, we've maybe never had coffee, and that's okay.
Do you have any advice on how to approach leaders and colleagues about areas of improvement and issues that arise?
I don't know if that question is about areas of improvement in personal or in the company, but I'm going to take it as perhaps in the organization, since the issues that arise. And in terms of how to approach that, one, thoughtfully. So there is something to be said still for writing out what you think is that those issues are. What's the background? What are the facts? What are the concerns? How do those concerns tie to the facts? When you write it out, it sort of helps you string that logic together. And then what are you asking for? What are you asking for? If there's a particular, this is an outcome I think I'd like to see, or if it is, I don't know what outcome, but I'd like these 3 things to be addressed. So thinking about the facts, what are the concerns? What's the impact if there is an impact already that's occurred? And then what are you solving for? Whether it's the impact because this is how something landed, or the impact because it seems to be having this impact on a broader population. Just framing it out thoughtfully, not that you have to sit down with people and read it, right? But just putting that together to really step back and go, does this rise to the level of this conversation? Is this the right person to have the conversation to really be circumspect in that process?
Thank you. We have no more questions at this point.
What
I would like to do, Callie, this was just wonderful. And if you allow me to ask you a question as well, my question is, looking back on your career, what are some key decisions you made regarding diversity inclusion issues that contributed to your success?
So one of them is that early on in my career, I led affinity groups, and the women's group, and then at some point was the diversity partner, and those things early on gave me really good perspective, and the mix of perspective, because they were at different points, right? I was at different levels, and so the lens on diversity, equity, inclusion, and what it meant for the work itself, for the opportunities. Those were important factors, and I think they've informed me as I've continued to grow in my career. So that would be one really key space.
Well, this was a fascinating presentation, Q&A session. I have taken so many notes here. So thank you for your insights and for this important presentation and discussion. We are inspired by your leadership, your commitment, and the great work that you have done to bring diversity, equity, and inclusion to the forefront. And you have provided so many insights and experiences that will prove very useful as individuals, teams, and organizations seek to make an impact in their own spheres of influence. And I also want to thank our audience members for taking the time to participate in this discussion and for their great questions. I hope you leave this conversation empowered and enlightened as you seek to create change in business and society. Callie, thank you again for your time and for the wisdom you have shared. This concludes our program, and have a great evening. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dean Alavi, and thanks everyone.